My area of expertise from a professional perspective is neurodiversity, so the diversity of our brains. When people hear that term, sometimes they think it's more complicated than it is. So just to make sure everyone knows what we're talking about here, we are literally talking about the fact that all of our brains are unique. So we all have diverse brains. So therefore we all sit under that neurodiversity umbrella. But there's kind of this categorization. So you have people whose brains are more fundamentally similar and those people who are more fundamentally different. Those people who are more fundamentally different might have a diagnosis such as autism, ADHD, dyslexia, etc. And I'm driven by the mission to make everyone and everywhere neuro-inclusive. So inclusive of everybody, regardless of how their brains work. There's a real link between the movement world, I think, and the way that we think about these things as well. Because for many neurodivergent people, they often have a need for different types of movement, more movement, and actually movement can really benefit them. So I'm really passionate about that particular area because it's actually a very easy thing to do to better support people and accommodate them.
Welcome back to the third season of the Make Movement Matter podcast. I hope you've enjoyed the mini episodes over the summer break, and I'm excited to get back into sharing some great conversations with you every Tuesday morning, covering a whole range of topics with more really inspiring people. If you're enjoying this podcast, please share episodes with your friends and family, and if you can take a moment to rate and review it, this really helps us reach a wider audience. Today's guest is Jess Meredith. Jess also believes passionately in the power of movement for all, but she isn't a movement coach. Jess is a different kind of trainer. Her aim is making everyone, everywhere, neuro-inclusive. She focuses equally on individuals and environments, and she wants to help the world unlock hidden talent, improve retention, creativity, and much more. A huge part of being neuro-inclusive is educating around the importance of movement in all our lives. In this fascinating conversation, we put workplaces and educational establishments under the magnifying glass. I believe this is a really important conversation for everyone, as it helps us all to think about the way our environments shape the way we do or don't move on a daily basis, and then how this affects us. It will also help you think about the changes we can aim for to make our modern world a more accepting and inclusive place that puts higher priority on everybody's need for movement to be able to thrive. Since learning about the importance of movement throughout our daily lives, it's made me question our modern world setup and notice all the areas of society that just aren't set up for movement. I met you when I talked at a recent mic drop short talks evening where we realised how much crossover we had in our work. Can you tell the listeners why you're also interested in this area and about your particular angle that you have that's made this take front and centre stage in your life and your work?
Yes, I can. And I'm so pleased we connected. And I'm sure everyone listening will realise, like we did, how much our worlds kind of intersect and how much of a similar but very different journey we've been on, I think, in this world. So my area of expertise from a professional perspective is neurodiversity, so the diversity of our brains. And when people hear that term, sometimes they think it's more complicated than it is. So just to make sure everyone knows what we're talking about here, we are literally talking about the fact that all of our brains are unique. So we all have diverse brains. So therefore we all sit under that neurodiversity umbrella. But there's kind of this categorization. So you have people whose brains are more fundamentally similar and those people who are more fundamentally different. Those people who are more fundamentally different might have a diagnosis such as autism, ADHD, dyslexia, etc., such as my daughter. And that is how my whole journey into all of this started. So learning more about her and her differences really helped me to, frankly, to be a better person. And it made me incredibly passionate about this whole area that is luckily getting a lot more airtime at the moment. So I set up a business, a social enterprise, where we go into workplaces, schools, universities, anywhere that will have us to talk about the power of our different brains. So do that through speaking, through workshops, through consulting, a whole manner of different things, And I'm driven by the mission to make everyone and everywhere neuro-inclusive, so inclusive of everybody regardless of how their brains work. And as I'm sure we'll get to as we talk more about it, there's a real link between the movement world, I think, and the way that we think about these things as well, because for many neurodivergent people, so these people who may have some of those diagnoses or those identities I mentioned, they often have a need for different types of movement, more movement, and actually movement can really benefit them. So I'm really passionate about that particular area because it's actually a very easy thing to do to better support people and accommodate them.
So interesting that you say easy thing to do, because it seems insurmountable in many places. Still, it seems like we're pushing against a hard brick wall. And if we could start by talking about workplaces. So you go into workplaces, what kind of barriers do you see in workplaces for movement, for people, for everyone?
So I think, it obviously differs on the workplace, but a lot of the workplaces I go into are office-based environments. And in an office-based environment, there is very little movement. You're just expected to sit at your desk. You might get up and go and walk to a meeting room where you'll sit back down again and everyone will stay seated. And that's just kind of what everybody's got used to doing. That's just the norm. And I don't think anyone questions that. And you also, as we'll go on to, you move from an education system where that's largely the norm as well. So everyone's just used to this way of being. So if you are somebody that needs more movement, and that can be anything, right? Like, as you talk about a lot, it's not just, I need to start running and jumping around this office. It might be that so for example, I'm using one of these under the screen. And for those that might just be listening, it's a Tangle, it's a type of fidget toy, otherwise known as a focus tool. That movement for me is really good. Like that, just moving my hands, for example. Mm-hmm. But if prior to doing this work, I would never have felt comfortable taking this into an office because people would have looked at me like, what is she doing? Because it's just not the type of thing people expect. So I think there's all of these norms that exist in terms of how we should be in a workplace and how people are expected to operate, which is all just very static. And people think that you are concentrating more, working harder, more professional if you're just static, which when you actually think about it, is just ridiculous.
In fact, I was just writing about this today. So spoiler alert, look back. It's not really a spoiler alert if it's looking back, but go back a few episodes to the summer minis, because I've just been writing about it today, because even the difference between sitting on the front of your chair and leaning against the back, even that little shift actually activates your core, makes you sit more upright, increases blood flow. You can also tap your feet and so on. So there's tiny shifts that you can even make, even in the seat you're in, as long as it's not on wheels, which is always a bit of a dodgy one. You don't want to go flying. But it's amazing how that there is so, as you say, I think it also comes down to sort of social norms, because it's been that way for a long time. Now, if you move in a different way, as you say, fidgeting with something, getting up and moving your arms and having a good old stretch, which of course everyone's really into stretching. They think, oh yeah, I love a good stretch. But because you're doing it in what seems like the wrong environment, it's not the gym or privately in your home, then you're seen as the weirdo. And I always talk about the weirdo because I'm always saying to my kids, embrace your inner weirdo, because that is our uniqueness. If we can embrace that and realize if that's good for us and important, then we should do it. And yet it's hard to do. It's hard to be the mum of 50 climbing in the park when there's no kids there anymore and things like that, because I know it makes me feel good. And it is good for me. And yet a lot of those people that we're talking about in the workplace, they know it's good for them. Their bodies are probably crying out for more movement. And yet, they feel that they can't.
It is so true. And I think back to before I kind of entered this world of neurodiversity. Obviously, the world of neurodiversity existed. It just wasn't I was frankly totally ignorant to it. And prior to that, I would have thought that about people. I would have thought, why are you
Yeah.
moving? Why are you doing something that, you're right, is for the gym or is for when you're in private? Like, you don't raise your arms. Or, I used to work in one office where I was in a digital team, and we had a separate office to the rest of the business, and it was like the cool team, because everyone always thinks that is a digital or tech team. And they had some exercise balls instead of chairs for some people. And you think, like, that's such a simple thing to do, and that's brilliant. It's just a little bit of movement. It's really good for your back. Every time I had a back problem, I was told to do that. When you're pregnant, you're told to kind of sit on those as well. But it's not the norm when you go into offices or in other places, where it absolutely should be. And it is such a simple thing to do to support people better, because why are we restricting ourselves to move or not move in a certain way? And I always talk about the only time I ever felt comfortable moving around in a meeting room. So I was in a lot of desk-based jobs before I did this, where I was always sitting down, and going to meetings, like I said, where you sit down again. And the only time I ever felt really comfortable to move around, or people accepted that was okay, was when I was pregnant. People seem to think, oh, she's moving because she's pregnant. She can go and stand at the back of the room now. She's still concentrating. She just needs to move. But any other time, absolutely not. That would not have, people would have looked at you like, why are you getting up whilst we're speaking, whilst we're trying to do something? Whereas that should be totally normalised.
Of course. And a lot of, from my memory of meetings when I was in a desk-based job, they would always go on far too long.
Yes.
People would be putting in far too much of their tuppence worth. And actually, do you know what? If you made them stand, I think they'd be quicker. And I reckon you'd get to the conclusion, the outcome quicker. Everyone would go back and get on with the work they wanted to be doing. And there's obviously been a lot of talk since COVID, or encouragement about walking. And that's one really good thing to come out of it. So I talk a lot about holding walking meetings. Obviously, if it's one-on-one, your walking meeting, it can be for 10 minutes. But why doesn't it need to be just literally going out the building, going around the block and coming back again? There's no issue with that. Why does it affect anything? It doesn't really. And also, I think, always talk about the bonus of walking is that you don't have to make direct eye contact.
Yes.
And with your teenagers, and so does that apply then?
It absolutely applies. And it's always one of my recommendations for people. For a lot of neurodivergent people, this isn't just about neurodivergent people, but for a lot of neurodivergent people, specifically autistic people, eye contact can be very difficult. That intense environment, if you're sat across a table from somebody and just looking at each other, especially in a one-to-one, or maybe you're having a difficult conversation as a manager with a neurodivergent person, having a walking meeting where no one needs to look at each other, it's much more relaxed. You're out moving your body. I always recommend that that's something that you should offer. It's not going to work for everybody, but at least offer that choice to somebody. So the norm and the expectation is not that you sit in this really intense static environment where everyone has to stare at each other. It doesn't work for people. So I always recommend that into people.
Yeah, and I can imagine, to be honest, that most people would quite like that, to be honest, because it is intense. And I think that, you can really see it with kids at dining room tables, particularly teens, when they sort of move away. They really don't want this moment. They want to go as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
And so what other things do you, when you go into businesses, what other things do you recommend?
So there are so many things. And one of the things that's really important to understand about things that you can do to support neurodivergent people is often, much like some of the things we've just talked about, these things benefit everybody. There's this really common misconception that they are adjustments that are going to be very laborious, maybe really like costly, and that are going to contradict the needs of like other people. And sometimes that's the case, but the majority of time, it's actually really simple things that is going to make it better for everybody. So on the movement type of thing that we've just talked about, being able to move in a meeting, everybody should have the choice to do that. And that will benefit lots of people. Walking meetings will benefit lots of people. But beyond the movement side of things, it's really about understanding the individual. So there's loads of different things that will support neurodivergent people, but they all have their own needs as well. So it's really about trying to understand what they do, and to cater to them. So you want to be creating an equitable environment rather than an equal one. So too much focus in the whole of our world, but definitely in workplaces, is on everybody getting the same. And we can't do it that way, because then we'd have to do that for everybody else. And it's actually not about that. It's about giving everybody what they need. And these fidgets are a brilliant example of that. Because I teach children about neurodiversity as well. I know we're going to speak about education more broadly afterwards, but we use these as examples, and we ask them if they think everybody should have these, because it's such a common misconception amongst teachers that if I give one of these to somebody in my class, everybody's going to want one. And we have these 8-year-old kids that quite clearly say, oh, well, actually, I really like using these, but they distract me, because if I'm using one, I'm just thinking about this and I'm playing with it and it's really fun and I've forgotten what the teacher's saying. But my friend here is autistic, and he really needs one to concentrate, because if he isn't using one, then he's worrying about what he's doing with his hands, he's needing to move and he can't, and therefore he can't listen to the teacher. And they get it so quickly. And that's what I go into workplaces to try and explain to us adults, who take a little bit longer sometimes to get these concepts, because we have been exposed to all of these norms and these ways of doing things that we've just got used to that don't always work. So it's really important that we start to challenge all these social norms and ways of doing things, and cater more for an individual's needs where possible.
Yeah. And do you recommend to people who are neurodivergent to actually say, these are my needs, this is what I prefer to do, and go to their workplaces if they feel comfortable to do so?
Yeah, it's a really complex answer to that question, because it really depends. But in general, I recommend everybody, whether they're neurodivergent or not, has a really clear understanding of themselves. That's the first step, because often people don't. So often people start to think, right, I'm going to go and I'm going to tell them I'm neurodivergent, but they don't even know what that means for them. There's a lot of people who are being diagnosed as adults now. I'm sure many people have seen in the media the kind of explosion of ADHD and autism, especially diagnoses for women, which is a great thing, by the way. That's a whole other debate that I can get into another time if we want to, but it's a good thing. We're not suddenly being overdiagnosed. It's a good thing. And if you don't understand yourself, you don't necessarily know what you're going to need. So that's like one of the first steps. But alongside that, if you feel like you have a supportive manager and you feel safe and you feel comfortable to share it, I always recommend that you do, because then that person can have a conversation with you and you can figure out together what might be the best way of working. But some of these things are not as complex as people think. Some of them around, communication needs. So it may be that you say, oh, actually don't like speaking so much on the phone. I much prefer it if we have a video call. Or, I process information much better if it's written down. So rather than you just come and tell me something, can you write an email? Or can you tell me and then follow up with an email? Some of these things can be really simple. And what I always recommend to managers is that they share the same things about themselves with the people in their teams. So it's not just, it's neurodivergent people that need these different ways. We all have ways
completely.
of working that work for us. So let's all share it. We can't always cater to everybody's needs, but we can have these grown-up conversations and we can figure out what works best outside of these, the boundaries of these norms that have been created for us.
Because ultimately that's to the benefit of the business in general, always, because people feel better because they feel like they've been heard, but also their ability to use their brain and to not be feeling like they're restricted in their bodies means that it can only be win-win, really.
100%. And I think that there is this, what organizations have got used to doing when new people join them is the manager or the person who's onboarding them will often say, this is how we work, this is what we need from you, like I'm going to teach you about the organization. And there's not that response that's required. They never ask, okay, so how do you work best? Let's make it your way.
Either you fit in our culture or you don't.
You don't, exactly. And so I can't remember who came up with this concept, but that, a lot of people talk about culture fits and you need to kind of fit into what they've created. And actually it's more about kind of how you can add to that culture, how you can add to the values of that business. And to do that, you need people who bring different experiences and different ways of thinking. So it doesn't become so, yeah, you need to either fit this way of doing things or you don't. And people are always worried that it's going to mean that you know, people are going to ask for things and then you can't give it to them. But if that's the case, you can just have a conversation around it. You can at least say, look, I really appreciate you sharing that with me. I totally understand why you might need that, or I totally understand what your experience is here. However, because of these reasons, we're just not quite able to do that. Let's think about, are there any alternatives? It doesn't need to be as binary as people think.
No, exactly. Often there's a halfway solution.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, and do you find that that sort of culture, and the expectations of people in businesses, do you find that is kind of a top-down thing where people in senior management have had a significant impact, or is it more of a historical thing where it's just the way the business has always been, regardless of who sort of moves into that senior management?
It can be different depending on the organization, but I think I rarely see an organization able to become really neuro-inclusive if they don't have their leaders on board, because people often will focus on people managers. Let's train people managers, which is absolutely vital, by the way, because they're the first port of call usually when someone tells you that they're neurodivergent. But even if the people managers have the knowledge and they know what to do or what they need to try to do, if the culture that is driven by leadership is quite rigid and the policies aren't neuro-inclusive, and actually there's an expectation of how people have to work, for example, if we're really tied to specific values that don't actually support a neurodivergent way of thinking, there's very little that people managers can actually do. They might be able to support them on a day-to-day basis, but they might not be able to support them to progress through the organization or to get everybody else to work with them in the best way. So you really need leaders on board. They don't necessarily need to play an active role in changing things, but they need to be really supportive that this is, we embrace everybody, and we embrace different ways of doing things. But it doesn't always happen.
And given that we talked about earlier, 1 in 5 people are neurodivergent, then 1 in 5 of those managers is in that situation, whether they know it or not, I suppose. And therefore, it really applies. I have heard of some great examples, actually, if I can just share. I was talking with someone called Alison Thompson, who's calls herself the safety elf, and she goes into businesses talking about posture and the setup of the workplace and so on, and also is really into the idea of allowing people to move more. So she's sort of making some good inroads in this, and she told me about an example where someone in the top decided an idea to allow people to move and get people moving more through the day was to rid the whole office of waste paper bins, so that everyone who had to and they weren't allowed to sort of stockpile their rubbish, they had to walk to take the waste to wherever. So if it was something they'd been eating, a wrapper or paper they were no longer using, whatever, and they had to walk down to where the bins were and back every time. So their steps obviously would naturally increase. Yeah. And that I find that really heartwarming, because these are the little signs where people realize that actually the interventions can be so simple, and they can be fun as well. They can be enjoyable things. You can even make things into a competition if it's healthy competition at work. There's all sorts that you can do, but it's just making those initial changes and seeing the advantage that when that person has taken their waste to wherever, when they come back, their brain is probably going to be having so much more oxygenation from having had that movement, that when they sit back down, they're probably going to be more productive anyway and just feel better about themselves.
Exactly. And I always, if I'm a bit stuck with something, or I'm feeling overwhelmed with something, or I'm trying to work through what I'm going to present or sort of create some content or whatever it might be, if I can't get anywhere, I'm like, right, just get up from my desk, go for a walk, and then the ideas just start coming into your head. If you stop yourself from thinking and you allow yourself to just move around, it is amazing what it does for your mind. And you're absolutely right that some of these things can be so easy to do. They just need a bit of thought, and they need someone to back them so that it doesn't become some silly idea. It's actually like there's a purpose to this, and we're doing this because it's better for everybody. And it was really interesting when you were telling that story, that it reminded me of when, so I have a friend, Alex Cunningham, who does mindfulness, and he said he always parks his car in the parking space that's really far away from wherever he needs to go, so that's increasing his steps every time. And it's such a small thing, and he's still using his car, because it's not realistic to be like, I'm never going to use my car, I'm never going to sit down ever again, but I'm just going to introduce these little things where I can. And sometimes we just need to take a step back and allow ourselves to come up with some of these simple ideas and then implement them in our routines.
Yeah. And there's a lot of inroads in particularly more modern businesses where, they put a gym in the office so that you can go to the gym at lunchtime and so on. But, not everyone's into the gym. And so, my ideal place, and I have seen places online, would be office meeting rooms that don't have chairs or tables, but you don't have to stand. You can sit, you can get on the floor, you can move around in different positions on the floor, and just be relaxed in your body, but getting absolutely loads of lovely movement through your hips. Because when we sit in chairs, our hips are the things that suffer. We rarely open out our hips, and it's so key to avoid having to go into hip replacements when we get older, ultimately, which is one of the most common surgeries we have for a reason. But yeah, who knows if that would be adopted. It would be adopted in my business if I had one.
It would be in mine as well if I could just expand a bit. But it's such a good point, because when you think about organisations that are doing a lot for neurodivergent people, so these are the ones that are quite far ahead. There's not very many of them. Some of them are implementing kind of sensory rooms, and the sensory room might look like something you've just described. So it wouldn't have typical chairs. It might have some bean bags in it. It might have some cozy space they can go and be on the floor. But that kind of thing is not just good for neurodivergent people. Neurodivergent people probably have more of a true need around it. So I do a lot of talking about what's a need versus a want, but actually it would benefit everybody, and that is such a great thing. Or maybe it's not even somewhere somebody can go to kind of calm themselves and regulate themselves, but you have somewhere else, like you said, it's a meeting room, but a meeting room that's just more interesting, really, and it's not just a table with some chairs around it. And it's why a lot of people tend to really enjoy the training that we deliver, because we incorporate movement into the training. So I hate sitting there and just watching people talk. Like, that's not interesting. Even if they're saying something really interesting, we'll do exercises where we get people to move around, put their hands in the air, and some people feel really uncomfortable about it. When I try and introduce that into law firms, when I go in there, you can see them thinking, I just want to sit here and answer questions, please. But it's so important to get people up and moving. And even if it's, we're going to run an exercise, but rather than put you in the groups sat around this big table, I'm going to make you choose an area I've created all the way around the room, and you have to get up off your chairs and you have to go around there. That's not huge movement, but it's just allowing people to move their body a little bit and release that kind of potential in their mind again.
Yeah. And to be honest, when you are talking to people, there's nothing worse than people having to listen for too long, because you can see in their body language, you can see in their faces, there's that maybe this is just when I talk.
It's never happened to me. I don't know what you're talking about, Wendy. They're always so engaged when I speak.
Oh dear. Okay, I'll have to rethink on that. No, I'm joking. But you know it yourself, as you say, when you're on the receiving end, no matter how invigorating it is or exciting to listen to, there are moments where you sort of can melt into your chair if you're not sat on the front edge of it like I do or whatever. And actually getting that sort of movement break in, it should be in everything. I mean, I just on a couple of weekends ago, I did a couple of movement breaks in a conference. So I was just there
I remember
to get everyone moving. And, I loved it because, again, I had the look of fear across the audience when they realized, and more fear of the unknown. What is she going to get us to do?
Mm-hmm.
But clearly they're all in quite limited space. They're packed in rows of chairs, very little space. So I had to be quite creative with what I got them doing. But in my usual style, I sort of incorporated it as daily life movements or imagining, visualizing, doing things, and then just basically moving their bodies more in different ways than they had been sitting. And you can just hear the energy rise, and then the talking gets going because they're partnered up to do something, and it joins people, it brings people together. And I feel that would be absolutely the case in a workplace too. I haven't, sorry, I'm yabbing on, but
please do.
I have one other example as well that also I found really heartwarming, which was in the very first early days when I started putting stuff out on social media, just before I started coaching. Someone started following me and we were messaging and so on. And he told me after a number of months that I had encouraged him to go and ask his organization to do movement breaks in the day. And they still do a set movement break mid-morning, mid-afternoon. It's led by someone in the company, and I think they alternate. And they're also used to it now that they're not embarrassed.
Wow.
They love it. They look forward to it because it is a break in the day. It's a break through doing something you might not necessarily always love to be doing. And they all feel better for it. And if that isn't evidence enough, I don't know.
Oh, that is so amazing, Wendy. Like, I wish more things like that. We need to standardize that type of thing. We need to standardize conferences having, exactly as you did, breaks in between speakers. So for some, some conferences, some training, some speaking engagements, it's not possible to get people up and moving, but you then can't make them sit there for hours and hours and hours and hours and expect them to be okay, because it's wasting everybody's time, because no one can concentrate, especially if it's a little bit hot in the room. You're going to get people nodding up even if you've got the most engaging speaker in the world. So we absolutely we absolutely need to standardize that, and at work as well, like you say, not only give people the opportunity just to move as they're doing their work, but to, if they haven't, to give them the opportunity alongside everybody else to get moving at specific times. I think it sounds so simple when you talk about it.
And, from listening to you about your work, particularly in the space of neurodivergence, I think it should prompt us, that new knowledge and that understanding, that should prompt us to say, hang on, even if you're not neurodivergent, you still have the need for movement. And therefore, let's normalize it for everyone. And therefore, no one has to feel different because it's just set and standard. It's the way that our work runs. And, I would bet that productivity would go through the roof, our economy would be flying, etc.
I totally agree. And I think it's, I wish more people understood that we all have a need around movement. And sensory processing is such a key part of understanding being neurodivergent, and it's something that I didn't have any idea about before I started learning about all of this. And I don't know how much you or everyone knows about sensory processing, but it's just the way that our bodies, or we kind of intake sensory information, how we process it, how we organize it, and how we then respond to it. But whenever people think about sensory processing, they think about the 5 senses we're taught about at school. So I'll probably forget them now, but taste, touch, smell, sound, sight. Yes, didn't say that. So those 5, thanks.
Way quicker than I would have done it.
the ones that we just think of when we think about our senses. But when we know about sensory processing, there are actually 3 other senses that people don't realize. And the first one is interoception, which is like our internal body sense. So that is, sensing the need to that we're hungry, hot, cold, in pain, need the toilet, all of those things. And then we also have 2 movement senses, so which is the ones that I care really passionately about. So we have proprioception and vestibular. And for neurodivergent people, for all 8 of those senses, they tend to have, it's a generalization, but they tend to have process them at the extreme ends. So I don't know if you know about the cup analogy when it comes to sensory processing.
No, I don't. Please tell me.
So I think it's something I learned really early on. It's helped me massively understand it. So if you imagine that we all have our own metaphorical cup for each of those senses, and some of us will have really small cups, and some of us will have really big cups, some of us will have cups in the middle. and you feel regulated. So kind of when your state of arousal meets the environment or meets what you need to do, which can be different depending on the activity. So if you are sleeping, it will be very different to if you're going to play sports or if you're going to be in a learning environment. But if your cup is full, exactly full, that's when you feel regulated. So that's when you feel good, you're ready to do whatever you need to do, and you're in the right kind of frame of mind. Now, if you have a really small cup, and every time you're experiencing that sense, it's getting filled up a little bit, your cup gets full really quickly, so you get overwhelmed by that sense really easily. If you've got a really big cup, it means you need a lot more of that sense in order to feel regulated.
Okay.
So it's a really useful way of thinking about it, because often when people think about neurodivergent people's needs, they think we'll all have small cups. So we're always very sensitive to sound, light, touch, that kind of thing. And that absolutely is the case for a lot of people. But we also exist on the other side of that. So if you take my daughter, for example, she has huge cups for vestibular and proprioception. So she needs an awful lot of the movement senses in order to feel regulated. So her OT said to me once that if she doesn't get enough movement, and for her that is things like hanging, swinging, jumping, climbing, if she doesn't get enough of all of that, it feels to her, you know, when you sit on an exercise ball and you lift your feet off the ground and it's really wobbly and uncertain, they said that's what she's experiencing all the time. So there's no way she's going to be able to sit and listen, concentrate, learn, because she's constantly trying to get herself regulated and balanced in this world. So I love the cup analogy because I think it gives us a really clear idea of why we all have these different needs. And whilst neurodivergent people's needs are more extreme, our cups are slightly, you know, on the bigger or smaller side, we all have these cups, and we will all have some areas where we need a lot of senses and some areas where we don't need so much. And so, you know, as you were saying, it applies to everybody, and understanding our own sensory profile is vital, because then we know how much movement we need or how much sound we need. And it's a big generalization, but it really, really helps.
That's brilliant. That makes so much sense to me. And so the vestibular as well, from the perspective of constantly sort of balancing, and that comes from that movement. So those movements you talked about all involve a level of a sort of a balancing regulation system going on.
Yes.
That's such a great analogy. Thank you for
really
sharing
good,
that.
Isn't it?
That
it's
really makes
good.
That's kind of slotted a few things into place for me, actually, really nicely.
Oh, amazing.
So moving on then to kids, because obviously, so that's now something that you are dealing with on a day-to-day basis, because you're constantly learning, I presume, about that. How do you find schools react to when you go in to talk about neurodivergence, and how well do you find they are set up at the moment? Varies, I'm sure, is the answer.
It really varies, but in general, the education system and the school environment is not set up for neurodivergent children, and it's certainly not set up for children who have big cups for the movement senses and have a high level of need to move. You will get schools that are really supportive, and you know, we're very lucky with the school system that my daughter's been in that really try to support that. But what happened, which is one of the reasons I absolutely love what you're doing and what we're talking about, trying to normalize it for everybody, is even in best case scenario right now in schools, you still have this very static way of working for everybody. And then if they know that they've got a neurodivergent child that needs more movement, they'll take them out onto movement breaks. So they might have like a trampette they can go and jump on, or someone might take them outside to do a bit of running around. There's not a lot of situations where that's done for everybody. And so then that child or those children can feel different. And so then sometimes they might reject that because they just want to conform and they want to fit in.
Absolutely. So much more important for a child even than an adult. Yes.
And that happens for children really early on. They start to realize, you know, so what works amazingly well for my daughter is a wobble stool. So, you know, a stool with just a domed other way around, you know, bottom. So it moves around. And she can concentrate so much better when she's sat on that. But she doesn't like to use it because she wants a blue plastic chair like all of her friends. So it's very, very difficult. And that's why I think it's better if we just start changing it for everyone.
I've also heard of little domes that you put on the chair you're sat on anyway, that are kind of, I don't know if they're fluid in them or something, and they also have sort of little spikes so that there's
a wobble cushion.
Yes.
So a wobble cushion works really well, and they're different shapes. Some of them are domes, some of them are kind of slanted, so they lean you forward a little bit. But for some people, that doesn't give them, some children, that doesn't give them enough movement. We tried that, and she didn't really get on very well with it. But lots of children do, and that's actually more subtle, obviously, because you can sit on your own chair. But the other thing they try as well is, I think you mentioned something similar earlier, but putting like an exercise band around the chair legs so that they can just kick it, over and over again and get that movement and still be sitting in a chair where no one can really notice. But I also find all of that a bit uncomfortable. Like, we just need to be normalising that this could work for everybody, and to put in movement into everything that they're doing.
Yeah, my son had a wonderful teacher. You know, when there's few teachers where you literally just want to call them wonderful, and you think that, they were always meant to be teachers. And I remember, so he was a Latin teacher, so he really had a hard job.
Wow.
Because people really sleep through that. But he would, and they had hour-long lessons. They changed from 35-minute lessons to hour-long lessons, and everyone just said, this is not good. And he, I don't think, agreed particularly with it. So midway through nearly every lesson, when he saw everyone's eyes just, people probably literally falling asleep on the tables, he would say, right, up, and he would send them off to run around the playground and come back again. And then you had a successful second half of the lesson. He would find that the kids could learn vocabulary so much easier. And that was for every child. And that would help any child. And one of my bugbears, I like to talk about being on the ground, or having the option of being on the ground, is the lack of circle time or carpet time. You used to have that in primary schools, where they were sort of set up so that it was an area and all the kids would crowd in, and they were all sort of leaning on each other and everything, which was lovely because it's sort of that tactile, it's really important. And then all of a sudden that goes. But I felt at such a young age. And I remember even in senior school sitting, yes, they were in sort of formed rows for assembly, but, we had to get up and down to the ground. We all had to sort of move and wriggle and so on, but we had to do it. And yet all of those things have gone. We've really sort of embraced the chair. And, with class sizes being so big in small rooms that can't take in more people, all these things go. And yet, you don't have to be down on the ground because you've got a chair, you've got a space. So you could get them all up and doing little chair squats and playing around a little bit. But it's this sad restriction that children aren't allowed to be playful. I actually looked up an article. I was reading a bit in preparation for this because, it's interesting that, so the stats are for children in general, in this one study, saying that just over half of children meet UK recommended guidelines, which is 60 minutes a day of movement. And that's just movement. So it means the rest of the time it's sedentarism. That's not even exercise. And that's really low. And, boys are better off than girls. They, they move more. I have 3 boys. I can see there's even more wriggliness in lots of ways. And girls tend to, I believe, sort of get affected by social norms a bit earlier and want to give up sport earlier and so on, and as they develop physically and so on. But it's and this study was saying, and I'm just looking down at my notes and it's tiny so I can hardly see, so I'll try my best. But it's saying that this prolonged sedentary time can lead to decreased physical fitness, higher stress levels, reduced concentration and learning abilities. So it's all of the stuff we know, and obviously health risks such as obesity. But then it said, however, barriers such as time constraints, I get that, safety concerns, that starts to annoy me. And then it said the need for quiet, controlled environments often limit their implementation. And this is a Biomed Central study.
Oh my goodness.
And that felt to me like a Victorian times statement, the sort of the feel of, sit still and be quiet kind
Totally.
of feeling. And yet, that's seen, this was a few years ago, this study, that's still seen as something that they feel is a requirement in a school system.
It makes me really angry because I don't understand why we've got to this point where that's what people think is the right way of doing things. It's just made up nonsense. It's not based on anything. I don't understand where the studies are that say children who sit really still and, look at the teacher and not out the window and aren't making any noise and aren't moving are the ones that are concentrating. That maybe for some, but not for all of them. It doesn't make any sense. And yeah, you're absolutely right. That is just wild, really. And that's not what we should be basing things on. And I think it just is embedded into absolutely everything that we do. And as you said, we tend to just, through the education system, show children, because this is what's happening, that they need to leave play behind. That happens really quickly. And they need to be sitting and they need to get older. And I know that my kids are still at primary school, that the kind of move from sitting on the floor to sitting at your desk is like, you're a big kid now, you're older, you're more mature, this is exciting. And it's like, why have we made it that? Why have we made it that this is like a privilege to be sitting at a desk rather than doing what you're naturally built to do, which is wander around, move your body, sit on the floor, get up and down? Why is this restriction that we put on children made out to be a real privilege for them? It's hard to backtrack from that once you're teaching children that's what it is supposed to be. And it's not just in the education system, it's not just in schools, it's how we all treat children. Not all, a lot of people treat children as adults. We force them to grow up into these systems that don't work for people. And if they're trying to do something that's a little bit younger in theory than their perceived age, they're babyish. Why are they playing with baby toys? Why are they still playing on a baby swing? Why are they, and we have the same for adults. Like, you don't go on a swing, you don't go down a slide, you don't do all these fun things. Why on earth not?
Yes, you do.
We have them in our house. So we have in our lounge, we gave into the fact that my daughter needs so much movement really early on because we were constantly going to the park, we were constantly out and about, and frankly, I was exhausted. So we have a swing inside our house. We have a lounge. In our lounge, we have monkey bars. We have a trampette. We have a climbing frame. We have. We don't. Oh no, we have. Yeah, we can put them on the door as well. So we have a gorilla gym. So on your door, you can have either a swing or a ladder or hoops. We've got a lot. We've got a peanut exercise ball. We've got so much stuff. And actually, it's great I'm on the swing all the time. We've got it on, so we can watch TV at the same time. Why would we not want to do that?
Can I come over?
It's
it sounds amazing. And so obviously, because of the world that I work in and I've now immersed myself in, I see lots of brilliant examples of that where the adult has said, what is going on? Why would you not? And therefore they have embraced that and literally their whole world is set up for play. And it always means that the adult plays with the child. And the most important thing there is that they are bucking that trend. They're seeing adults playing. They're seeing that they're having fun in the same way, the smiles, the laughter, that they're feeling good from it. There can be a little healthier competition in what they're doing. But, and the parents are obviously proud of the child for their movement rather than standing at the edge of the sports field going, brilliant, you've scored a goal or whatever, and it being restricted to that environment. It's much more, as you say, about free play. One of the things that always annoys me is when I see on a play park a sign saying up to age 12 or something. That's the first, then I'm jumping straight on. And I'm not usually like that, but things like that where it restricts movement for not really any good reason. I mean, I'm sure structural safety comes into it a little bit, but they look pretty strong and I'm not that huge. So, But,
well, yeah, exactly. On our monkey bars at home, it takes up to 100 kilos. So, and it's so funny watching my partner do it because he thinks he's quite strong and like he does do quite a lot of exercise, but he can't carry himself on those monkey bars. Yet my kids are like swinging from one to the other. So it just shows that we need to keep these things up to keep our bodies doing what they can do.
And that's the perfect example, because that's, trace that back to early man. That is the kind of thing we had to do to get through the undergrowth when you were behind someone who's on the hunt and you had to move through. And, we come from apes. They were swinging. We were using our arms in that way. And it's so beneficial for our shoulder girdle, for our spines, for our grip strength, all of it. We know it's good. It just, again, it's these social norms where comfort and convenience has taken over from sense, in my mind. But also, like you're doing, you still have to, we have to realize the world is not going to change. We've come this far because, that sort of drive to be more sedentary in a way is always going to be there. We just need to know how to buck those trends, how to make choices around things. And just like in the wonderful work you're doing, going into places and saying, have you thought of this? There is another way. And it can benefit everyone, not just the 1 in 5 who are neurodivergent, but all 5.
Everybody. Exactly. Yeah. And sometimes it's literally that. They just haven't thought about it and they just need someone to go in and they're like, oh yeah. And you can see the cultures that are more accepting of that in the workplace. I ran a training session once and a virtual one, and someone came and they were walking on their treadmill as they were listening. I was like, this is the kind of organization that you need to be, the one that people don't look at that and think, what are they doing? And just think, oh yeah, that's because that's what they need, and good for them doing it. Actually, I should go and get I should listen to this whilst I'm out walking around the block.
There's also great boards that you can stand on that are sort of slatted wood, but they're sort of shaped and they crisscross, and you can be stood at your standing desk, but you're permanently having movement, so you're permanently having to adjust. Which that things like that are such wonderful inventions, and they're not pitched at neurodivergent people; they are pitched at just anyone. So everyone has that need. I've got one client who has had knee problems for a long time, and working with me, he's noticed, as I'm always encouraging him to move throughout the day, because it's not just about coming to me for an hour, it's really about how you live. And certain things had got worse on the days that he's sat for all the Zoom calls and doesn't move. And so he's now put it together himself. But he feels the need when it's a sort of a listening Zoom call, just attending, he feels the need and happily does so, but he has to turn the camera off, then gets up and does his movements, and he's listening, he's fully there, he's learning, and then he can turn it back on to contribute when he needs to. But isn't it sad
that you have to do that?
We're a distraction if we're moving.
Absolutely, I know. And for some, this is when it's really interesting in the neurodiversity space, because for some people it will be a distraction. For some people with ADHD, watching a lot of other people move, it will be a distraction, and that's when people's needs are contradictory. But in that case, great example, easy solution. They turn their camera off, no one gets distracted, they get it what it wants. Where I do have more of an issue is where they're turning their camera off because it's not socially acceptable, or people might think, what are they doing? Or they shouldn't be doing that. That's when it becomes much more of a problem.
Yes.
And that's when you've got an issue with the culture that needs shifting.
Whereas he's now starting to think, right, I'm going to start campaigning. This is all wrong. So great. He's taking the mantle and he's running, it's brilliant. Exactly. Because once you realize the importance, because if it's for him, it's the difference between being in pain and not being in pain. And, that's not going to work well, is it? If you're in pain, you can't work properly because you're distracted by something that's really bringing you down. So,
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it has been wonderful talking to you. We obviously
likewise
keep going for a long time. Thank you for your wise words. You've obviously doing some brilliant work in this space, and keep doing what you're doing. Anyone who wants to get in touch with you, how do they find you?
So you can get me via email at jess@differingminds.co.uk, or you can check out our Differing Minds website, or I'm very active on LinkedIn. So I'm Jess Meredith on there if anyone wants to connect.
Absolutely. And so they should. So, and definitely get you in. You're doing wonderful, wonderful work. Have you got any sort of final thoughts, recommendations, any sort of last final message that you would like to send out into the ether?
Just to echo what you talk about, somewhat of an issue with the term movement break, because I think it's focusing us on the wrong thing. And yes, we have to have movement breaks because of the world that we've set up, but let's all campaign for actually just instilling movement into everything that we're doing. And one of the best ways we can do that is to be that person at work, or be that person going into schools talking about it and that kind of thing.
Ah, interesting. I like that. Okay. We can talk about that more, but not now.
For the next episode.
For the next time. Yes, exactly. Come back for that one. Thank you so much for your time, Jess. Really grateful.
Thank you, Wendy.
I hope you've enjoyed listening, and if you have, you can help by doing 3 things. First, press the follow button to tell podcast platforms you want to listen again. Second, please give the show a 5-star rating and leave a review about why you liked it. And third, I'd love you to share it with friends and family or on your socials, for which I'm truly thankful. Finally, if this podcast is making you want to start reclaiming your own movement, join me in the Reclaim Movement membership for classes, both live and by replay, and countless videos of mini movement breaks to add into your daily life, covering practical and fun, important natural movements. Visit reclaimmovement.co.uk/membership to get started with your 7-day free trial. See you for the next episode, and thank you so much for listening.